He'd grown up in Cedar Ridge where neighbors still left their doors unlocked, and the worst crime was usually teenagers knocking over mailboxes on Halloween. This kind of violence, this level of cruelty, it belonged to the news, to distant cities where bad things happened to other people. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice as gentle as he could manage while his mind raced. "My name is Ethan Carter. This is my land, my farm. I'm going to get you free, okay? But I need you to stay calm." He pulled out his phone to call 911, but the woman's reaction stopped him cold. She lunged forward against her chains with desperate strength, her eyes wide with panic. "No," she gasped. "No police, they're... Some of them are working for him. You can't trust them. You can't trust anyone." Ethan stared at her phone halfway to his ear. "My mother was a nurse before she retired. I know basic first aid, and the house has everything we need for now." The walk to the farmhouse took twice as long as usual, partly because Ethan was carrying Sophia, but mostly because he found himself stopping every few yards to listen, to watch, to make sure they weren't being observed. The paranoia felt foreign and uncomfortable, but he was beginning to understand that Sophia's fear wasn't irrational. Someone had chained a woman to a tree and left her to die. That same someone was presumably still out there, still looking for her. The farmhouse kitchen had always been the heart of the Carter home, a large, comfortable room with a wooden table that had served 4 generations of family meals, arguments, homework sessions, and crisis meetings. Ethan settled Sophia into one of the Windsor chairs his grandfather had made, then immediately set about gathering what she needed. When she saw him, relief flickered across her features before being replaced by something that looked like anger. "You shouldn't have come," she said without preamble. "This isn't your fight anymore." "Like hell it isn't." Ethan squeezed through the gap in the fence, noting that she'd positioned herself with multiple escape routes through the mechanical room, back toward the main garage, or deeper into the building's infrastructure. "Amanda Reynolds is missing. They got to her before you could make contact." The news hit Sophia like a physical blow. She closed her eyes and leaned back against the concrete wall, the weight of another person's life adding to the burden she was already carrying. "How long?" she asked. "Detective Kowalski thinks she disappeared yesterday evening around the time she was supposed to meet with you. Her editor found notes about Lane Industries and your phone number on her desk. So they know I was trying to reach her, which means they know the story is about to break." Sophia opened her eyes, and Ethan saw something new there, not fear, but calculation. Unless they can silence everyone who knows about it. "The police have the evidence now. The SD card you gave me, I turned it over to Detective Kowalski. Even if something happens to us, the truth is going to come out." "Will it?" Sophia stood up, pacing in the small space behind the boiler. "You're assuming the Chicago PD is clean, that there's no one on Marcus's payroll in the department. You're assuming that digital evidence can't be destroyed or discredited. You're assuming a lot of things that might not be true." The possibility that he'd handed over their only leverage to people who might be compromised hadn't occurred to Ethan, and the thought made his stomach clench with anxiety. In Cedar Ridge, police were neighbors, people you went to church with, and whose kids played on the same Little League teams as yours. The idea that law enforcement might be actively working for the criminals was alien to his experience. "So what's the alternative?" he asked. "We can't run forever. Eventually they'll find us, or we'll make a mistake, or we'll run out of money and places to hide." "There is another option." Sophia stopped pacing and fixed him with a look that was equal parts determination and desperation. "We go on the offensive. Instead of waiting for them to find us, we find them first. Find them and do what? Get evidence they can't destroy or discredit. Not digital files that can be deleted, but testimony from people who were directly involved. Force them to make mistakes in public where witnesses can see. She pulled out a smartphone, not the one she'd had at the farm, but a new device that looked expensive and sophisticated. I've been doing research while I waited for you to either show up or get yourself killed. Marcus isn't just laundering money through Lane Industries. He's been using our logistics network to move actual product. Product? Drugs, mostly, but also people and weapons. Lane Industries has trucking routes, shipping contracts, and warehouses all across the Midwest. We're perfectly positioned to move anything from anywhere to anywhere else, and our legitimate business provides cover for cargo that customs officials might otherwise find suspicious. Sophia's voice grew harder as she spoke, and anger giving her words sharp edges. He's turned my family's company into the backbone of a criminal empire. Ethan felt sick thinking about the implications. How many people know about this? More than you'd think. It's not something one person could organize alone. There have to be dozens of employees involved, from warehouse supervisors to shipping clerks to accountants who cook the books. The problem is that most of them probably think they're just cutting corners or avoiding regulations, not enabling murder and human trafficking. But some of them know the truth. Some of them have to. And some of those people might be willing to talk if they thought they could do it safely. Sophia held up the phone. I've been going through old personnel files, looking for employees who were fired or quit unexpectedly around the time the money laundering started. People who might have seen something they weren't supposed to see. It was a plan, Ethan realized. Not a perfect plan, and certainly not a safe one, but it was proactive rather than reactive. Instead of waiting for their enemies to find them, they would hunt for allies among the people who had been hurt by Marcus Lane's corruption. You found someone. I found several someones. The question is whether we can reach them before Marcus's people figure out what we're doing. Sophia looked at him seriously. But Ethan, if we do this, there's no going back. Right now, you're just a farmer who got involved by accident. If we start actively investigating Lane Industries, you become a direct threat to a billion-dollar criminal operation. They won't just try to scare you away, they'll try to eliminate you permanently. The weight of the decision settled on Ethan's shoulders like a physical burden. Everything Sophia was saying was true. He could still walk away, go back to Cedar Ridge, and try to pretend that none of this had happened. The smart thing, the safe thing would be to let the Chicago PD handle the investigation and hope that justice would eventually prevail through proper channels. But looking at Sophia's face in the dim light of the underground garage, seeing the combination of hope and fear in her eyes, Ethan knew that walking away wasn't really an option. Not because he was brave or noble, but because some things were more important than personal safety. "Who's first on your list?" he asked. Relief flooded Sophia's features, followed immediately by renewed determination. Janet Morrison. She was the head of accounts payable for our shipping division until 18 months ago. According to her personnel file, she was fired for asking too many questions about irregular payment authorizations. She's been working as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm in Evanston ever since. And you think she'll talk to us? I think she'll talk to me, especially if I can convince her that she's not the only one who noticed the irregularities. Sophia stood up, checking her watch. It's almost 5 o'clock. If we can catch her as she's leaving work before she gets home where her family might overhear. They made their way back through the garage to Ethan's truck, moving carefully to avoid the sight lines of the surveillance teams positioned around the building. The drive to Evanston took them through some of Chicago's most affluent suburbs, a world of manicured lawns and houses that cost more than most people made in a lifetime. It was another reminder of the gulf between Sophia's background and his own, though she seemed unconscious of the difference. The accounting firm where Janet Morrison worked was housed in a modest office building that catered to small businesses and independent professionals. They parked across the street and waited, watching employees filter out of the building as the workday ended. Sophia had pulled up Morrison's employee photo on her phone, but when the woman finally appeared, she was almost unrecognizable. The Janet Morrison in the Lane Industries files had been professionally groomed, confident, the picture of corporate competence. The woman walking toward the parking garage looked tired, worn down, as if 18 months of financial uncertainty had aged her a decade. She moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned to make every dollar stretch, every decision calculated against its cost. "She looks scared," Ethan observed. "She should be. Marcus doesn't leave loose ends, and she knows enough to hurt him badly." Sophia took a deep breath. "Stay here unless something goes wrong. If she sees both of us approaching, she might panic and run." Ethan watched as Sophia crossed the street and intercepted Morrison near her car, a 10-year-old Honda with a dent in the passenger door. The conversation was too distant for him to hear the words, but he could read the body language, Morrison's initial alarm giving way to surprise, then recognition, then something that might have been hope. They talked for nearly 10 minutes, their voices becoming animated, urgent. Morrison kept glancing around the parking garage as if expecting to be overheard, but whatever Sophia was telling her seemed to overcome her caution. Finally, Morrison nodded and gestured toward her car. Sophia returned to the truck with the satisfied expression of someone who had just won a crucial victory. "She'll meet us at her apartment in 2 hours," Sophia said as Ethan started the engine. "She needs time to think about what she wants to say and make sure her ex-husband isn't planning to drop by with the kids tonight. She's going to talk. She's been waiting 18 months for someone to ask the right questions. Apparently, the irregularities she noticed weren't just about money. They involved shipping manifests for cargo that didn't match the bills of lading, drugs moving through legitimate supply chains, concealed inside shipments of agricultural products. The confirmation of what they'd suspected should have been satisfying, but instead Ethan felt a growing sense of dread. Each piece of evidence they gathered made the conspiracy larger, more entrenched, more dangerous to expose. "How many people has Marcus killed to keep this secret?" he asked. "I don't know, but I'm starting to think Amanda Reynolds wasn't the first." Sophia's voice was tight with controlled anger. Janet mentioned 2 other employees who were fired around the same time she was. One of them, a warehouse supervisor named Tony Castillo, died in a car accident 6 months ago. Single vehicle crash on a straight stretch of highway, no skid marks, no apparent cause. And the other one, Maria Santos, a shipping clerk. She moved back to Mexico after she was terminated, supposedly to be closer to her family. But Janet said Maria was terrified when she left, convinced that someone was going to kill her if she stayed in Chicago. The scope of Marcus Lane's willingness to eliminate threats was becoming clear, and it painted a picture that made Ethan's blood run cold. This wasn't just corporate crime. It was a systematic campaign of murder designed to protect a criminal enterprise worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "Sophia," he said carefully, "if we keep digging into this, if we find more people who are willing to testify, we're going to be painting targets on their backs. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the suburban streets, sliding past the truck's windows. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of a decision that would define the rest of her life. "My grandfather built Lane Industries to feed people, to provide good jobs for working families, to be a force for positive change in the world. My father expanded it with the same values, the same commitment to doing the right thing, even when it cost more money." She turned to look at Ethan. "Marcus has turned it into something that destroys lives, that preys on the vulnerable, that makes money by spreading misery. If I don't stop him, then I'm complicit in everything he's done and everything he's going to do. Even if it gets us killed. Especially if it gets us killed. Because if we don't fight back, then the next person who stumbles onto the truth will face the same choice and the next one after that. Eventually, someone has to decide that some things are worth dying for. Janet Morrison's apartment was in a complex that had been upscaled 20 years earlier, but now showed the wear of deferred maintenance and economic pressure. The hallways smelled of cooking food and industrial cleaning products, the kind of place where working-class people raised families and hoped for something better. Morrison met them at the door, her nervousness evident in every gesture. "I've been thinking about this conversation for 18 months, she said, as she led them into a living room furnished with pieces that had clearly been chosen for durability rather than style. "I knew when they fired me that what I'd seen wasn't just accounting errors or shipping mistakes, but I also knew that nobody was going to believe me if I tried to blow the whistle." "What exactly did you see?" Sophia asked, settling onto Morrison's couch with the kind of unconscious authority that came from years of executive meetings. Morrison pulled out a manila folder thick with photocopied documents. "I started noticing the irregularities about 6 months before they fired me. Payments being authorized for shipping services. We weren't using cargo manifests that didn't match the bills of lading trucks arriving and leaving at odd hours without proper documentation." She spread the documents across her coffee table, each one a piece of a larger puzzle that painted a picture of systematic criminal activity. "This one," Morrison said, pointing to a shipping manifest, "shows a truck carrying 12 tons of corn from our facility in Iowa to a distributor in Detroit. But the payment authorization shows we were charged for transporting 24 tons. The difference was cargo we never officially received and never officially shipped." "Ghost cargo," Ethan said, understanding immediately. "You transport legitimate goods to create a paper trail, but you also transport other things that don't appear in the official records." "Exactly. And the payments for the ghost cargo were always handled through a separate accounting system that bypassed normal oversight. When I started asking questions about the discrepancies, my supervisor told me to mind my own business. When I kept asking, they fired me for insubordination." Sophia leaned forward, studying the documents with the intensity of someone who understood their implications. "Janet, do you have copies of the payment authorizations, the ones that show the ghost cargo fees?" "Some of them. I made copies before they escorted me out of the building, but I was careful about which ones I took. I didn't want them to know I was documenting their crimes." The next hour was spent reviewing Morrison's evidence, cross-referencing shipping dates with payment records, identifying patterns that revealed the scope of the operation. By the time they finished, Ethan had a clearer picture of how Marcus Lane had turned his family's legitimate business into a criminal empire. The genius of the scheme was its simplicity. Lane Industries already had trucks moving agricultural products across the country, warehouses where cargo could be temporarily stored, and a network of distributors who were used to receiving shipments without asking too many questions. Adding illegal cargo to the mix required minimal additional infrastructure and provided perfect cover for moving anything from drugs to weapons to people. "The volume is staggering," Sophia said, adding up figures in her head. "Based on what you're showing me, Marcus has been moving several $1 million worth of illegal cargo every month for at least 3 years. And that's just what I could document from my position in accounts payable," Morrison replied. "There were whole shipping routes I didn't have access to, entire warehouses that used different accounting systems." The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear, but so was its vulnerability. An operation this large required the cooperation of dozens of people, from truck drivers to warehouse supervisors to accountants. Most of them probably didn't understand the full extent of what they were involved in, but some of them had to know they were handling illegal cargo. "We need more witnesses," Ethan said. "People who can testify about what they've seen, what they've been asked to do. Morrison's evidence is crucial, but it's just paperwork. We need someone who can describe the actual crimes. There's a truck driver named Pete Kowalski, no relation to your detective friend, who used to handle some of the irregular shipments, Morrison said. He was always nervous about the jobs, asking too many questions about what he was carrying. Last I heard, Marcus's people had transferred him to local deliveries, only routes where he couldn't see the bigger picture. Think he'd talk to us? If you can convince him he's not the only one who noticed the problems, maybe. Pete's got a family, 3 kids, and a mortgage. He's not going to risk everything unless he's sure it will make a difference. They spent another hour going through Morrison's contacts, identifying other employees who might have seen evidence of the criminal operation. Each name represented both a potential witness and another person who could be in danger if Marcus Lane decided to silence everyone who knew too much. By the time they left Morrison's apartment, it was nearly 11 o'clock, and Ethan's exhaustion was catching up with him. They'd driven to Chicago on adrenaline and determination, but now the reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. They were 2 people going up against a criminal organization with unlimited resources and a demonstrated willingness to kill anyone who threatened their operation. "We need somewhere safe to spend the night," Sophia said as they walked back to his truck. "Somewhere Marcus's people won't think to look." "Hotel. Too easy to trace, especially if they have contacts in law enforcement. We need somewhere off the grid, somewhere we can plan our next moves without worrying about surveillance." Ethan thought about the problem as he started the truck. In Cedar Ridge, there would have been dozens of options, friends who would take them and family members with spare bedrooms, even just empty barns where they could sleep safely. But Chicago was a different world, one where he had no connections and few resources. "There's a truck stop about 50 miles west of here," he said finally. "The kind of place where drivers sleep in their homes and nobody asks questions about strangers. We can park in the back, catch a few hours of sleep, and figure out our next move in the morning." It wasn't ideal, but it was anonymous, and right now anonymity was more important than comfort. They drove through the Chicago suburbs in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what they'd learned and what it meant for their survival. The truck stop was exactly what Ethan had promised, a sprawling complex of fuel pumps, restaurants, and parking areas designed to serve the long-haul truckers who kept America's economy moving. They found a parking spot in the back, surrounded by dozens of other trucks, whose drivers were sleeping through the night before continuing their journeys. "I've never slept in a truck," Sophia said, trying to make herself comfortable in the passenger seat. "It's not the Ritz, but it's safe. And tomorrow we start hunting down more witnesses." Ethan adjusted his own seat, knowing he wasn't going to get much rest, but hoping for a few hours of peace. "Ethan," Sophia's voice was soft in the darkness. "Why are you doing this, really? You could have turned that SD card over to the police and walked away. You could have gone back to your farm and let other people handle the investigation." It was a question he'd been asking himself since leaving Cedar Ridge, and he still wasn't sure he had a complete answer. Part of it was simple decency, the inability to walk away from someone who needed help. Part of it was anger at the injustice of what Marcus Lane had done, not just to Sophia, but to all the employees he'd corrupted or intimidated or killed. But there was something else, something he wasn't sure he was ready to articulate even to himself. "You remember what you said about your grandfather building Lane Industries to feed people and provide good jobs?" he said finally. "My grandfather felt the same way about our farm. 3 generations of Carters have worked that land not to get rich, but to grow food that families needed to be part of something bigger than themselves. And people like your uncle think they can just take that, corrupt it, turn it into something evil for their own profit. They think decent people will just roll over and accept it because fighting back is dangerous." Ethan shifted in his seat, trying to find a more comfortable position. "Maybe I'm just too stubborn to let them be right about that," Sophia was quiet for so long that he thought she'd fallen asleep. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an emotion he couldn't quite identify. "In all the years I've been running Lane Industries, I've never met anyone like you," she said. "People who wanted my money or my influence or what I could do for their careers, but never someone who was willing to risk everything just because it was the right thing to do. You haven't been hanging around with the right people." "No, I haven't, but maybe that's about to change." Outside the truck, the sounds of the highway continued through the night. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional rumble of an engine starting, the whispered conversations of drivers grabbing coffee before continuing their journeys. It was the sound of America working, moving, striving towards something better. Tomorrow, they would continue their hunt for witnesses, continue building the case that would either destroy Marcus Lane or get them both killed. But for now, in the anonymous safety of the truck stop, they had a few hours of peace to prepare for whatever came next. Neither of them slept well, but both of them dreamed of a world where justice mattered more than profit, where ordinary people could stand up to extraordinary evil and have a chance of winning. Whether those dreams would survive contact with reality remained to be seen. Dawn broke gray and cold over the truck stop, the kind of morning that promised rain and made every shadow seem threatening. Ethan woke to the sound of diesel engines warming up and the distant clatter of coffee cups in the all-night diner, his neck stiff from sleeping in the truck's cab. Beside him, Sophia was already awake, staring out at the parking lot with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she'd been thinking hard about their next moves. "Pete Kowalski lives about 30 miles from here," she said without preamble. "I found his address in the employee database I downloaded before everything went to hell. If we're going to approach him, we need to do it this morning before he heads out on his delivery route." Ethan rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the fog of too little sleep and too much stress. "You've been planning while I was unconscious. I've been thinking about what Morrison said last night. If Pete was transferred to local deliveries because he was asking too many questions, then Marcus's people are keeping him close, monitoring what he does. That means we might not have long before they notice we're talking to former employees." The logic was sound, but it also meant they were operating under an increasingly narrow window of opportunity. Every witness they approached was another chance for Marcus Lane's organization to notice the pattern, to realize that Sophia wasn't just hiding, but actively building a case against them. They drove through Chicago's industrial suburbs in the pre-dawn darkness, past warehouses and factories that formed the backbone of America's economy. It was territory that felt more familiar to Ethan than the upscale neighborhoods they'd visited the day before, the working-class communities where people earned their living with their hands and worried about making mortgage payments and keeping food on the table. Pete Kowalski lived in a ranch house on a street lined with similar homes, each one representing someone's version of the American dream scaled down to realistic proportions. His driveway contained a Lane Industries truck company logo, prominently displayed on the cab doors, and a 10-year-old sedan that probably belonged to his wife. "Let me approach him alone," Sophia said as they parked across the street. "He's more likely to trust someone he recognizes from company meetings than a complete stranger." Ethan watched from the truck as Sophia walked up to Kowalski's front door, noting how she'd changed her posture and bearing to seem less threatening, more vulnerable. It was a calculated performance, but also genuine. She really was asking this man to risk everything he'd worked for on the word of a woman who'd been declared mentally unstable by her own family. The conversation at the front door was brief, with Kowalski glancing nervously up and down the street before inviting Sophia inside. She was gone for nearly an hour, and when she finally returned to the truck, her expression was grim. "He knows," she said, settling into the passenger seat. "He's been hauling ghost cargo for 3 years, but he thought it was just tax avoidance, maybe some minor customs violations. He had no idea about the drugs or the money laundering or any of the rest of it." "Will he testify?" He wants to, but he's terrified. 3 kids, a mortgage, medical bills from his wife's cancer treatment last year. If he loses his job with Lane Industries, his family loses everything. Sophia's voice carried the weight of understanding exactly what she was asking of people like Kowalski. But he gave me something that might be even better than testimony. She pulled out a small device that looked like a USB drive. GPS tracker data from his truck. Pete's been keeping records of every delivery he's made for the past 2 years, including the off-the-books runs. Routes, timestamps, cargo weights, everything. He started doing it because he was worried about liability issues, but now it's a complete record of illegal activity. The implications of what she was holding made Ethan's pulse quicken. That's proof of criminal activity. It's proof that Lane Industries trucks have been making regular deliveries to locations that don't appear in our official shipping records. Combined with Morrison's financial documentation, it paints a picture that even Marcus's lawyers would have trouble explaining away. They were building a case piece by piece, witness by witness, but they were also painting increasingly large targets on their backs with every person they approached. Marcus Lane had already demonstrated his willingness to kill to protect his operation, and the evidence they were gathering would be enough to send him to prison for the rest of his life. "There's more," Sophia continued. "Pete mentioned something about a warehouse on the south side where some of the irregular cargo gets processed. He's never been inside, but he's made several deliveries there, always at night, always with minimal paperwork. Think it's worth checking out? I think it might be the heart of the operation. The place where legitimate agricultural products get mixed with illegal cargo before being distributed through our normal channels." Sophia's eyes held the kind of dangerous light that came from seeing a path to victory, no matter how perilous. "If we can document what's happening there, get photographs or video evidence of actual criminal activity, we'd have enough to bring down the entire conspiracy," Ethan finished. "But we'd also be walking into the most dangerous part of Marcus's operation." The warehouse district of Chicago's South Side felt like a different world from the suburban neighborhoods where they'd been interviewing witnesses. Industrial decay and urban renewal existed side by side, abandoned factories, sharing blocks with modern logistics facilities. It was the kind of area where unusual activity would go unnoticed, where trucks could come and go at all hours without attracting attention. The address Pete had given them led to a nondescript building, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. The structure itself was probably 60 years old, built when American manufacturing was at its peak. But it had been recently renovated with new security systems and modern loading docks. Lane Industries logos were prominently displayed on the building, and the gate declaring it to be a legitimate part of the company's distribution network. "Looks normal enough," Ethan observed as they drove past the facility for the second time. "That's the point. From the outside, it's just another warehouse handling agricultural products. But according to Pete's data, trucks make deliveries here that never appear in our shipping manifests." Sophia studied the building with the analytical intensity of someone trained to spot inefficiencies and irregularities. "See those security cameras? That's military-grade surveillance equipment, not the kind of thing you need to protect corn and soybeans. So how do we get inside to see what they're really doing? We don't. Not during business hours anyway. But tonight, after the regular employees go home and before the irregular shipments start arriving." Sophia trailed off, but the implication was clear. "You're talking about breaking and entering. I'm talking about investigating criminal activity taking place in a building owned by the company I'm supposed to be running." There was steel in her voice, the authority of someone who'd made difficult decisions before. "But you're right. It's dangerous, probably illegal, and definitely stupid. When do we do it?" The question surprised them both. Ethan hadn't consciously decided to participate in what amounted to an amateur espionage operation, but somewhere in the conversation it had become inevitable. They'd come too far and risked too much to turn back now. Tonight, Pete says the regular shift ends at 6 and the off-the-books deliveries usually start around midnight. That gives us a 6-hour window to get in, document what we find, and get out before the real criminals show up. They spent the rest of the day preparing gathering equipment and information that might help them survive what they were planning to attempt. A visit to an electronics store provided a digital camera with night vision capabilities and several extra memory cards. A stop at a surplus store yielded dark clothing flashlights and a set of bolt cutters that could handle the warehouse's security fence. But the most important preparation was psychological, coming to terms with the fact that they were about to cross a line that would make them active participants in a very dangerous game. Up until now, they'd been gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses, activities that were questionable but not obviously criminal. Breaking into a warehouse was different, a commitment to an irreversible course of action. "You know," Ethan said, as they sat in a McDonald's parking lot, reviewing their plan, "when I woke up 3 days ago, the biggest worry in my life was whether I could make the mortgage payment on my farm. And now I'm planning to break into a building owned by one of the largest corporations in America to photograph evidence of drug trafficking and money laundering." He shook his head. "It's not exactly the career change I was expecting." Sophia smiled for the first time since they'd met, a real expression of warmth that transformed her face and reminded Ethan that underneath the corporate authority and desperate determination was a woman who'd had her entire world turned upside down. "When I was a little girl," she said, "my father used to tell me stories about my great-grandfather, who started the company with nothing but a grain elevator and a determination to help farmers get fair prices for their crops. He said the family business wasn't just about making money, it was about making the world a better place." Sounds like a good man. He was, and he'd be horrified by what Marcus has done to his legacy. The smile faded, replaced by the kind of quiet resolve that moved mountains. "Maybe what we're doing tonight isn't just about stopping criminals or gathering evidence. Maybe it's about honoring the memory of people who built something good and watched it get corrupted." As evening approached, they drove back to the South Side warehouse, this time parking several blocks away, in an area where Ethan's farm truck would blend in with the other working vehicles. The neighborhood was quieter now, the daytime bustle of legitimate commerce replaced by the kind of cautious stillness that came after dark in industrial areas. The warehouse looked different in the evening light, more ominous somehow. The security lights that had seemed merely professional during the day now felt like searchlights, and the razor wire atop the fence gleamed with predatory sharpness. "Last chance to change your mind," Sophia said, as they gathered their equipment. "You too." "Not a chance. This is my company, my responsibility." She checked the camera one final time, making sure the night vision settings were configured properly. "Besides, I've never been particularly good at sitting on the sidelines." The approach to the warehouse required a careful balance between speed and stealth. They needed to move quickly enough to minimize their exposure, but slowly enough to avoid triggering motion sensors or attracting the attention of security patrols. The fence was the first obstacle, its height and razor wire designed to discourage casual intrusion. Ethan's bolt cutters made quick work of the chain link, creating an opening large enough for them to squeeze through. The real challenge was doing it quietly, the metallic snapping of cut wire sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. Once inside the perimeter, they had to cross 50 yards of open ground to reach the warehouse itself. The loading dock area offered some cover shadows cast by parked trailers and stacked pallets, but it also felt like a gauntlet lined with security cameras and motion detectors. "There," Sophia whispered, pointing to a service entrance on the side of the building. Maintenance door probably alarmed, but it's our best option for getting inside without being seen. The lock was more sophisticated than Ethan had expected, an electronic system that required either a key card or a numeric code. But the door frame itself was older built when physical security relied on solid construction rather than digital technology. Think you can force it? Ethan examined the frame, noting where age and weather had weakened the wood around the deadbolt. Maybe, but it's going to make noise, and once we break it, anyone who checks will know someone was here. We're already past the point of subtlety. Do it. The crowbar he'd bought at the surplus store was designed for exactly this kind of work. 3 sharp blows to the frame splintered the wood around the lock mechanism, and the door swung open with a squeal of protesting hinges that seemed to echo through the entire building. Inside the warehouse was a cavern of shadows and mechanical sounds, the hum of refrigeration units and ventilation systems, creating a constant background noise that would mask their movements, but also make it harder to hear if someone else was in the building. Emergency lighting provided just enough illumination to navigate between towering stacks of pallets and shipping containers. Agricultural products, Sophia said, reading labels as they moved deeper into the facility. Corn, soybeans, wheat flour. Everything looks legitimate so far. But as they ventured further from the loading dock area, the character of the stored goods began to change. Containers without proper labeling, pallets covered with tarps, shipping crates that seemed too small for bulk agricultural products. And underlying it all, the kind of careful organization that spoke of serious money and professional management. Here, Ethan said, pulling back a tarp to reveal what lay beneath. This isn't corn. The crates were unmarked, but heavy, their contents shifting slightly when moved. Sophia used a pry bar to open one corner, revealing plastic-wrapped packages that definitely weren't agricultural products. Even in the dim light, the white powder inside was unmistakable. Cocaine, she breathed. Millions of dollars worth right here in my family's warehouse. The camera's flash seemed unnaturally bright in the darkness, but the images it captured would be worth the risk. Package after package of illegal drugs stored alongside legitimate food products, ready to be distributed through Lane Industries' normal shipping channels. There's more over here, Ethan called from deeper in the warehouse. Jesus, Sophia, you need to see this. What he'd found was even more damning than the drugs, a sophisticated processing operation where legitimate agricultural products were being used to conceal illegal cargo. Machinery for vacuum sealing packages, scales for precise measurement, even a small laboratory where chemical purity could be tested. It was a criminal enterprise operating with corporate efficiency and resources. How long has this been going on? Sophia asked, photographing everything with methodical thoroughness. Long enough to build all this infrastructure. Years, probably. Ethan explored the laboratory area, noting equipment that cost more than most people made in a year. Your uncle didn't just stumble into money laundering, he built a criminal empire. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through their investigation like a knife. Multiple engines, heavy trucks from the sound of them turning into the warehouse complex. Sophia and Ethan froze, listening as the vehicles got closer, their headlights beginning to illuminate the loading dock area. The midnight shipments, Sophia whispered. They're early. The euphemism was darkly amusing under the circumstances, but the reality wasn't funny at all. They were trapped inside a building that was about to be flooded with people who would kill them without hesitation if they were discovered. Exit strategy, Ethan asked, though he suspected they were already past the point where strategy mattered. Fire exit on the far side of the building, if we can reach it without being seen. Sophia didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew the odds weren't good. Moving through the warehouse while trying to remain invisible was like navigating a three-dimensional maze where every wrong turn could be fatal. The sounds from outside were getting closer, truck doors slamming, voices calling instructions, the mechanical whir of loading dock doors being raised. They'd made it perhaps halfway to the fire exit when the warehouse lights came on, transforming the space from a realm of shadows into a brightly lit arena where hiding became impossible. Ethan grabbed Sophia's arm and pulled her behind a stack of shipping containers, hoping their dark clothing would blend with the shadows that remained. "Delivery from Detroit," a voice called from the loading dock area. "Same as usual, but the boss wants everything processed tonight instead of waiting for the weekend." "Why the rush?" another voice replied. "Heat's getting intense. That missing heiress has people asking questions, and there's rumors about federal investigations. Better to move everything out of the warehouse before someone comes looking." The irony was bitter. Marcus Lane's attempt to eliminate his niece had created exactly the kind of attention he'd been trying to avoid. But that realization wouldn't help them if they were discovered by the people now unloading illegal cargo just 50 feet from where they were hiding. The next 30 minutes were an exercise in controlled terror as they listened to the criminals work processing shipments with the kind of professional efficiency that spoke of years of practice. Drugs being repackaged into agricultural containers, money being counted and recorded, shipping manifests being falsified to conceal the true nature of the cargo. And through it all, the growing certainty that their hiding place was temporary at best. Eventually, someone would need something from the area where they were concealed, or a routine security sweep would reveal their presence. When that happened, their investigation would end permanently. "There," Sophia breathed so quietly that Ethan barely heard her. "Service corridor along the east wall. If we can reach it, we might be able to get to the fire exit." The corridor she'd spotted was 30 yards away across open floor space, but it offered the only path to safety that didn't involve walking directly through the area where the criminals were working. It would require perfect timing and more luck than they had any right to expect. They moved during the loudest part of the unloading process, when the sound of forklifts and hydraulic systems would mask their footsteps. The corridor was narrow and lined with pipes and electrical conduits, but it led in the right direction and provided blessed concealment from the activity in the main warehouse. The fire exit was locked from the inside, but the panic bar mechanism worked exactly as designed. The door opened onto an alley behind the warehouse, flooding them with cool night air that felt like salvation. "Don't move," a voice said from the darkness. They froze, hearts hammering, as a figure stepped out of the shadows near the building's corner. He was young, maybe 25, wearing the kind of expensive clothes that suggested he wasn't just hired muscle. When he spoke again, his accent carried the educated precision of someone who'd grown up with money. "Well, well, the prodigal heiress returns and she's brought a friend." The man smiled with the kind of predatory amusement that made Ethan's skin crawl. "Uncle Marcus is going to be so pleased to see you again, Sophia. He's been worried sick." "Hello, Kevin," Sophia said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I should have known Marcus would send his favorite nephew to clean up his messes." Kevin Lane, because that's obviously who he was, gestured with the pistol he'd been keeping concealed behind his back. "Family business after all. Though I have to say, breaking into warehouses is a new low even for you. Not as low as human trafficking and drug dealing. That's just capitalism with fewer regulations." Kevin's smile never wavered. "Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to give me that camera and whatever other evidence you've been collecting, and then you're going to come with me for a family reunion. And if we refuse, then your farmer friend gets to find out what happens to people who interfere in Lane family business." The pistol shifted slightly, pointing directly at Ethan's chest. "Your choice, cousin." For a moment, everything hung in perfect balance. 3 days of investigation, witness interviews, and evidence gathering, all depending on Sophia's next decision. She could surrender, try to negotiate, maybe buy time to think of another option. Instead, she threw the camera as hard as she could in Kevin's direction, while simultaneously diving toward the opposite end of the alley. The movement was so unexpected, so contrary to what any rational person would do when facing an armed opponent, that Kevin hesitated for a crucial second. That second was all Ethan needed. He lunged forward, tackling Kevin around the waist and driving them both to the ground. The pistol flew from Kevin's grip, clattering across the asphalt and disappearing into the shadows. What followed was a brief, vicious struggle between two men who understood that losing meant death. Kevin was younger and probably in better shape, but Ethan had the desperate strength of someone fighting to protect someone he cared about. When it ended, Kevin was unconscious, and Ethan was bleeding from a split lip and several deep scratches. "Camera," Sophia said, retrieving the device from where it had fallen. "Still intact, and we got everything we needed." "Kevin. He'll live, but he's going to have a headache when he wakes up." Ethan checked to make sure the younger man was still breathing. "We should be long gone before that happens." They ran through the industrial district, putting distance between themselves and the warehouse while sirens began to wail in the night. Whether the police response was related to their break-in or just the normal background chaos of urban crime, they couldn't afford to find out. It wasn't until they were back in Ethan's truck driving through Chicago's empty streets, with the warehouse's evidence safely captured on the camera's memory card, that either of them spoke about what had just happened. "Thank you," Sophia said quietly, "for what you did back there. Kevin would have killed you without hesitation if you'd given him the chance." "Kevin's your cousin. Marcus's son. He's been groomed since childhood to take over the criminal side of the business when his father retires." Her voice carried the kind of sadness that came from watching family destroy itself. "There was a time when Kevin and I were close, when I thought he might be the one person in the family I could trust completely. What changed? Money changed. Power changed. The corruption that Marcus brought into the company infected everyone around him, including his own children." Sophia stared out at the city lights sliding past the truck's windows. "I used to think that if I could just expose the truth, the family would come together, want to fix what had been broken. Now I realize that some of them are too far gone to save." The evidence they'd gathered that night was devastating proof that Lane Industries was being used as a front for massive criminal operations, that Marcus Lane had built an empire based on drugs, money laundering, and human trafficking. Combined with the witness testimonies they'd collected, it would be enough to destroy the conspiracy and send its architects to prison for the rest of their lives. But it would also tear apart everything that Sophia's grandfather and father had built, destroying a legitimate business that employed thousands of people and provided food for millions more. The choice she faced was between allowing evil to continue or sacrificing something good to stop it. "What happens now?" Ethan asked. "Now we finish what we started. We take this evidence to people who can use it properly, and we make sure that Marcus and everyone who helped him face justice for what they've done." Sophia's voice carried the weight of a decision that would define the rest of her life. "Even if it means destroying everything my family built." "That's not what your father would have wanted." "My father would have wanted justice. He would have wanted the truth to come out no matter what it cost." She turned to look at Ethan, and in her eyes he saw something new, not just determination, but a kind of peace that came from finally knowing what needed to be done. Besides, maybe destroying the old company is the only way to build something better in its place. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east as they drove toward downtown Chicago, carrying evidence that would change everything for one of America's largest corporations and the thousands of people whose lives it touched. Behind them, in a warehouse on the south side, criminals were probably discovering that their operation had been compromised. And somewhere in a corporate boardroom, Marcus Lane was about to discover that his niece had survived his attempt to kill her and was now actively working to destroy everything he'd built. The final confrontation was inevitable, but for the first time since this all began, Ethan felt like they might actually have a chance of winning. The federal building in downtown Chicago looked like a fortress of glass and steel, its imposing facade designed to inspire either confidence or intimidation, depending on which side of the law you found yourself on. As Ethan parked his truck across the street, he couldn't help but think about how different this moment felt from when he'd first discovered Sophia chained to that oak tree just 5 days earlier. Then his biggest concern had been making his mortgage payment. Now he was about to walk into the FBI field office with evidence that could topple one of America's largest corporations. Second thoughts, Sophia asked, though her own resolve seemed unshakable as she checked the camera and documents one final time. About the evidence, no. About walking into a federal building when we're not entirely sure who can be trusted. Ethan adjusted his tie, still feeling awkward in the business clothes they'd bought that morning. Maybe. Detective Kowalski vouched for Agent Sarah Chen. 20-year veteran, spotless record, specializes in corporate corruption cases. Sophia's voice carried the kind of professional confidence she'd developed in boardrooms, but Ethan could hear the underlying tension. If we can't trust her, we can't trust anyone. They'd spent the early morning hours preparing for this moment, organizing the evidence into a coherent narrative that would be impossible to dismiss or discredit. Janet Morrison's financial records, Pete Kowalski's GPS data, the photographs from the warehouse, witness statements from employees who'd been intimidated into silence together. They painted a picture of systematic criminal activity that reached into the highest levels of Lane Industries. The FBI field office was bustling with the kind of controlled energy that spoke of serious people doing important work. Agent Chen met them in the lobby, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes, and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd seen every variety of corporate lie and criminal excuse. "Ms. Lane, Mr. Carter," she said, shaking hands with professional courtesy. "Detective Kowalski briefed me on your situation. I understand you have evidence of criminal activity involving Lane Industries." "We have evidence of criminal activity conducted by Lane Industries," Sophia corrected. "There's a difference." Agent Chen led them to a secure conference room where they could spread out the documents and present their case without fear of being overheard. The next 2 hours were spent walking through the evidence methodically, each piece building on the others to create an undeniable pattern of money laundering, drug trafficking, and murder. "This is substantial," Chen said, finally studying the photographs from the warehouse. "But I have to ask, how did you obtain some of this evidence? These images appear to have been taken inside a private facility without authorization." "I'm the majority shareholder and acting CEO of Lane Industries," Sophia replied. "I had every right to inspect company facilities, even if my uncle's people would disagree with that assessment. And the assault on Kevin Lane, self-defense. He pulled a gun on us in an alley behind the warehouse. Mr. Carter prevented what would have been a double homicide." Chen made notes in a file that was already growing thick with documentation. "We'll need to verify your accounts with physical evidence from the scene. But assuming everything checks out, this gives us probable cause for search warrants on multiple Lane Industries facilities." "How long will that take?" Ethan asked. "Under normal circumstances, weeks, maybe months. This level of corporate investigation requires coordination between multiple agencies, careful legal preparation, and political approval at the highest levels." Chen looked up from her notes. But these aren't normal circumstances. The evidence you've provided suggests an immediate threat to public safety, which gives us authority to move quickly. How quickly? I can have search warrants signed by this afternoon and executed tomorrow morning. But I need to warn you, once we move on, this everything becomes public. The news media, the financial markets, employees, and customers, everyone will know that Lane Industries is under federal investigation for serious crimes. The weight of that reality settled on Sophia's shoulders like a physical burden. The company her grandfather had built, that her father had expanded, that employed thousands of people and fed millions more, would be forever tainted by the criminal activities that Marcus had grafted onto its legitimate operations. There's no other way. Not if you want justice, Chen said gently. Criminal enterprises this sophisticated don't collapse from internal pressure. They have to be exposed publicly, completely, with enough evidence that no one can claim it's just a misunderstanding or a few bad actors. Sophia was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photographs that documented her family's fall from grace. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of a decision that would define the rest of her life. Do it. Execute the warrants, expose everything. Let the consequences fall where they may. She looked up at Chen. But I want to be there when you arrest Marcus. I want to look him in the eye when his world comes crashing down. That's irregular. Family members typically aren't present during arrests of this magnitude. I'm not just a family member. I'm the victim of attempted murder, the CEO of the company he's corrupted, and the person whose testimony will help put him in prison for the rest of his life. There was steel in Sophia's voice now, the authority of someone who'd run a billion-dollar corporation and wouldn't be denied. I'm going to be there, Agent Chen. The only question is whether I'm there as part of your operation or as an independent actor who happens to show up at the same time. Chen studied her for a moment, then nodded. I'll make arrangements. The next 24 hours passed with agonizing slowness as federal agents prepared for what would be one of the largest corporate raids in Chicago history. Search warrants were secured for Lane Industries headquarters, the South Side warehouse, 3 other facilities across the Midwest, and the homes of Marcus Lane and his key associates. Evidence teams were assembled, arrest warrants were prepared, and coordination was established with law enforcement agencies in 6 states. Ethan found himself in the surreal position of being consulted on operational details for a federal investigation, his knowledge of the warehouse layout and security systems proving valuable to agents planning the raid. It was a reminder of how far he'd traveled from his quiet life in Cedar Ridge, both literally and metaphorically. Nervous? Sophia asked as they sat in Agent Chen's car outside Lane Industries headquarters, waiting for the operation to begin. Terrified, Ethan admitted. You, heartbroken, angry, determined. She watched employees entering the building for what many of them didn't know would be their last normal day of work. But not nervous. I know we're doing the right thing. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, federal agents moved simultaneously on all targets. The headquarters building was surrounded by unmarked cars as agents presented warrants to stunned security guards and began the process of securing evidence and taking key personnel into custody. Marcus Lane was in his executive office when Agent Chen knocked on his door, flanked by 2 other agents and followed by Sophia and Ethan. The expression on his face when he saw his niece very much alive and obviously cooperating with law enforcement was worth all the danger they'd faced over the past week. "Hello, Uncle," Sophia said, as agents read Marcus his rights. "Surprised to see me? You always were too stubborn for your own good," Marcus replied, though his voice shook slightly. "Just like your father. It's going to destroy you in the end." "Maybe. But it's going to destroy you first. The arrests made national news within hours, with financial networks scrambling to explain the implications of Lane Industries' collapse to investors and markets worldwide. The company's stock price went into freefall, trading was suspended, and emergency meetings were called in boardrooms across the country as other corporations tried to assess their own exposure to the unfolding scandal. The warehouse raids yielded even more evidence than Sophia and Ethan had documented during their night infiltration: millions of dollars in illegal drugs, sophisticated money laundering operations, and records that implicated criminal organizations across North America and beyond. The scope of Marcus Lane's empire was larger than even the FBI had suspected. But the most significant discovery came from Marcus's personal files, encrypted documents that detailed not just the extent of his criminal activities, but also the network of corrupted officials, law enforcement officers, and business leaders who had enabled his operations. The investigation that had started with one woman chained to a tree was expanding into a multi-state examination of systemic corruption that reached into some of America's most trusted institutions. "It's going to take years to unravel all of this," Agent Chen told Sophia and Ethan as they watched evidence being cataloged in a federal warehouse. "But what you two started has already prevented millions of dollars in drug trafficking and exposed corruption that goes far beyond Lane Industries." "What happens to the company now?" Sophia asked. "To the legitimate operations, the employees who had nothing to do with Marcus's crimes?" "That's partly up to you. As majority shareholder and CEO, you have options for restructuring the business, selling off assets, or potentially rebuilding under new management." Chen's expression softened slightly. "The clean parts of the company, the legitimate agricultural operations, they're valuable assets that employ a lot of people. With proper oversight, there's no reason they can't continue operating." The idea of rebuilding rather than simply destroying was appealing. But Sophia knew it would require years of effort and constant vigilance to ensure that the corruption Marcus had introduced was completely eliminated. It would mean dedicating her life to repairing the damage her family had done, accepting responsibility for crimes she'd never committed, but that had been carried out in her name. 2 weeks after the arrests, Sophia stood once again beneath the ancient oak tree on Ethan's farm, though the circumstances couldn't have been more different. The chains that had once bound her to its trunk had been replaced by white ribbons and flowers decorations for a ceremony that represented hope rather than despair. Sheriff Elena Martinez stood before them, with a worn Bible in her hands, smiling at the incongruity of conducting a wedding ceremony in a pasture 40 miles from the nearest church. But it seemed appropriate somehow. The place where their story had begun was also where they would promise to face whatever came next together. "I've officiated a lot of weddings in my career," Martinez said, "but I don't think I've ever married two people whose courtship involved federal raids and warehouse break-ins." "We like to think we're special," Ethan replied, earning laughter from the small crowd of witnesses they'd assembled. Grace Murphy from the diner was there, along with Detective Kowalski Agent Chen, and a handful of neighbors from Cedar Ridge who'd driven out to see their local hero marry the billionaire heiress he'd rescued from certain death. "Ethan Carter," Martinez continued, "do you take Sophia Lane to be your wife, to stand with her through federal investigations and corporate restructurings, through good harvests and bad for richer or poorer, though in her case definitely richer in sickness and in health, till death do you part?" "I do," Ethan said, meaning it more completely than he'd ever meant anything in his life. "And Sophia Lane, do you take Ethan Carter to be your husband, to stand with him through droughts and floods, through simple farming and complicated criminal prosecutions, to love and honor him, whether he's tending crops or testifying before Congress, till death do you part?" "I do," Sophia replied, tears in her eyes, as she looked at the man who'd risked everything to save her life and help her find the courage to do the right thing. Then, by the power vested in me by the state of Illinois, and with the blessing of that old oak tree that's seen more drama than a soap opera, I pronounce you husband and wife." Martinez grinned. "Ethan, you may kiss your bride, but try not to get arrested for it." The kiss was sweet and brief, appropriate for a public ceremony, but promising more intimate moments to come. When they broke apart, the applause from their small audience was heartfelt and genuine, the sound of people who'd witnessed something real and lasting, being born from extraordinary circumstances. Grace Murphy had provided a wedding cake that she'd transported carefully in her van, along with coffee and sandwiches for the reception that took place on picnic tables in Ethan's backyard. It wasn't the kind of wedding that billionaire heiresses usually had, but it was perfect for a woman who'd learned to value authenticity over appearances. "So what's next for the happy couple?" Agent Chen asked as the informal reception wound down. "Honeymoon in some exotic location, where extradition treaties don't apply." "Actually," Sophia said, "we're thinking about staying right here. There's a lot of work to do rebuilding Lane Industries into the kind of company my grandfather envisioned, and it turns out that work goes better when you have a partner who understands the value of keeping your feet on the ground. Plus," Ethan added, "someone has to keep an eye on this farm. Can't let 3 generations of Carter agriculture go to waste just because I married into corporate intrigue." The plan they'd developed over the past 2 weeks was ambitious but achievable. Sophia would restructure Lane Industries, selling off the assets that had been compromised by criminal activity and focusing the remaining operations on legitimate agricultural business. The profits from those operations would fund a foundation dedicated to supporting family farms, providing low-interest loans and technical assistance to help small agricultural operations compete with corporate agriculture. It was a way of honoring both their backgrounds, Sophia's corporate expertise and Ethan's understanding of what farmers actually needed to survive and thrive. More importantly, it was a way of turning something that had been corrupted by greed and crime into a force for positive change. "The irony," Sophia said, as she and Ethan watched their wedding guests drive away, leaving them alone beneath the oak tree as the sun set over the fields, "is that Marcus was right about one thing. The company needed to change, needed to modernize and expand into new markets. He just chose the wrong markets." "Your grandfather would be proud," Ethan said, pulling her closer as the evening air grew cool. "You saved the company he built and turned it into something even better." "We saved it. There's no way I could have done any of this alone." They stood together in comfortable silence as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. 2 people who'd found each other under the worst possible circumstances and discovered that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships produced the most extraordinary results. The ancient oak tree that had witnessed their first meeting now stood as a symbol of their commitment to each other and to the values that had brought them together. Its roots ran deep into soil that had nourished generations of crops, while its branches reached toward a sky that promised new seasons of growth and renewal. In the distance, the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkled like earthbound stars, a reminder of the community that had welcomed them and supported their efforts to do the right thing even when it was dangerous and difficult. Grace Murphy's diner would continue serving coffee and pie to farmers and travelers. Sheriff Martinez would continue keeping the peace with wisdom and compassion, and life would go on with the quiet dignity that small towns did better than anywhere else. 6 months later, the trials of Marcus Lane and his associates would dominate headlines as federal prosecutors presented evidence of a criminal conspiracy that had infected one of America's largest corporations. The testimony that Sophia and Ethan provided would be crucial in securing convictions that sent dozens of people to prison and recovered hundreds of millions of dollars in criminal proceeds. But tonight, in the peaceful darkness of an Illinois farm, none of that mattered as much as the simple fact that two people who'd started as strangers had found in each other the missing pieces of their own lives. Sophia had discovered that real strength came not from corporate power, but from the willingness to stand up for what was right, regardless of the cost. Ethan had learned that his small-town values and determination to help others could make a difference even in the face of impossible odds. Their greatest wealth, as they'd promised each other in their vows, was no longer measured in dollars or acres, but in the trust they'd built, the love they'd discovered, and the life they were creating together on soil that represented both their past and their future. The oak tree stood guard over their dreams, as it had for generations before them, its ancient strength, a promise that some things love justice, the determination to do right by one another, could endure whatever storms the world might bring. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the fields, where 3 generations of carters had grown crops to feed their neighbors, Ethan and Sophia would wake up as husband and wife, ready to face whatever challenges their new life together might hold, knowing that they'd already survived the worst and discovered the best in each other. The chains were gone, replaced by choices freely made and promises gladly given. Their story had begun with captivity and fear, but it would continue with freedom and hope rooted in the rich soil of the American heartland, and reaching toward possibilities as limitless as the sky above their heads.